Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, and now it's time for our weekend recap. We're going to kick it off with the Mayer versus Ryan rematch that delivered just as much, if not more, than their initial meeting. And at least Michaela picked up where she left off, whereas Sandy took a different approach at the start. You saw Michaela dart out of a corner, shooting jabs upstairs, shooting jabs downstairs, and bringing other punches over, while Sandy was trying to move and punch, move and counter, which really wasn't a good idea.
Because looking for a big counter resulted in her being second best for most of the first half of the fight.
I had it a clean sweep after 4. Even though some gave Sandy Ryan the second round, I didn't. I didn't see what she did in that round to have won it.
Michaela Mayer was so obviously the more aggressive fighter, the busier fighter. She was the one pressing the issue, whereas Sandy was backpedaling, trying to counter Michaela's jab over the top. And sometimes she did, but it wasn't enough to keep Michaela off of her.
Michaela was the one doing most of the work, and as a result, she was the one winning most of the rounds. That's how I saw it. Not saying that Sandy didn't get in with a few punches of her own here and there, good ones, hard ones, but it seemed to me that Michaela Mayer was well ahead of Sandy going into the second half of the fight.
Way ahead on the scorecards.
I think what they wanted from Sandy was to set up a big counter to maybe hurt Michaela and get her out of there, which is why she started off the fight moving and punching, but that caused her to get away from what her strengths were in this fight, that she is naturally bigger than Michaela. She's been at this weight longer, and she should have been the one pressing the issue at the start. She should have been the one coming forward. Working off the counter in the first half resulted in Sandy being second best and having to play catch-up in the second half.
Now, in the second half, as a result of doing most of the work in the first, Michaela Mayer starts to slow down. Sandy Ryan grows into the fight, starts to come forward, look for big punches.
I gave Sandy Ryan at least 2 out of 5 rounds in the second half of the fight.
But by then it was too little and too late. You waited too long to start laying into Michaela Mayer and going after her, getting at it.
Saw a cut open up on the side of Michaela Mayer's right eye. Bleeding profusely, though manageable because it's not on the eyelid. The eyelid is the worst spot for a cut,
because every time you blink, it's going to sting, and that's going to open up the cut even more, and worse, the blood that comes out is going to seep right into the eye, impairing the fighter's vision, whereas this cut, it was more on the side,
opening as a result of a clash of heads after the half. Sandy Ryan definitely grew into the fight as Michaela Mayer started to slow down, fatigue and the damage setting in tandem with the cut and battling through it. Sandy grew into the fight later on, but it was too little and too late. By then, she was at a noticeable deficit.
You would have thought that having Kay Karoma in her corner, who used to train Michaela Mayer, would have given Sandy the inside track and a better plan of action to win the rematch. But near as I can tell, she decided to start off this fight boxing.
Instead of being the aggressor, which would have suited her since she's the naturally bigger girl and the bigger puncher, you would have thought that Kay Karoma would have given Sandy a better plan of action, because Michaela Mayer won wider this time than she did the last one.
She won by a wider margin.
And so we know what options are on the table for Michaela Mayer now. An undisputed title fight with Lauren Price, maybe a rematch with Natasha Jonas to avenge the loss,
or a rematch with Alicia Baumgartner for a lot of money.
All of which we'll discuss in another video. You have to wonder, coming off the second loss to Michaela Mayer and the third in her overall boxing career, what does Sandy Ryan do now? WBC lightweight champion Carolyn Dubois stated, "I haven't seen the fight yet between Sandy and Mayer, but I know the result. I don't want to see Sandy packing it in or being disheartened. She is extremely talented. She just needs to show patience and grit. Opportunities will come, and being undefeated in this era is overrated."
So what should Sandy Ryan do now? She should move up to junior middle.
The reason for it is the talent pool is a little thinner at junior middle, and I could very much see Sandy beating some of those champions that are up there, so that by the time she picks up a belt or she unifies at 154, the girls at 147 will be moving up, like Lauren Price.
I don't know that Matchroom is going to sever ties with Sandy Ryan as a result of these 2 losses to Michaela Mayer.
But if they don't, and they keep her on board, what she should do is move up to 154. She's got the size, the skill, the pedigree, and now the experience to become a champion up there. I'm confident that if they stand by her and start on a junior middleweight campaign, Sandy will be a champion again and build herself up for another big fight.
This doesn't have to be the end. For now, congratulations to Michaela Mayer, who I picked to win the first fight and the second fight. She has once again delivered onward and upward.
Now on the undercard, we saw WBO welterweight champion Brian Norman make his first successful defense of the brown belt, though not without going through a bit of adversity at the start, as Derek Cuevas got in with a really short left hook, I believe it was a left hook, that rocked Brian Norman to his core. His legs buckled and looked like he was in trouble there for a second, but he weathered the storm, absorbed the shot, gathered his bearings, and got back to it in the second round, where he returned the favor
and finished the fight in the third with a right hand, left hand combination.
A few well-placed punches from a very strong, physically strong Brian Norman, who at his best is a mid-range to inside fighter. And just based on what I've seen from this fighter so far, I don't see a guy that beats Jaron Ennis.
After Jaron Ennis takes care of business with a Stanionis, who I think is made to order for Jaron Ennis, after Boots beats him,
the focus will shift back over to a potential Brian Norman fight that Matchroom tried to make last year, but couldn't get the Normans on board. They wanted more money.
More than they're worth.
That strategy ended up costing the Normans a lot of time, because where you didn't want to unify, a Stanionis does, and now they're fighting him. And if this keeps up, they could always go to Mario Barrios, see if he wants to make some cash.
If he wants to unify.
The advantage Team Ennis has always had over Team Norman is that Matchroom is 100% behind them and putting up the money to make unification matches happen, where Top Rank never made a play to do a Boots fight, or a Stanionis fight, or a Barrios fight. They never tried.
The advantage Team Ennis has always had over Team Norman is that Matchroom is more invested in Team Ennis than Top Rank is invested in Team Norman.
The only thing Team Norman can do is sandbag it in the hopes that eventually they'll be able to ask for more money. The danger is you could lose before that happens, even if you didn't lose yesterday.
It's a leverage play to where if we hang on to the last puzzle piece, we can then ask for more money, not realizing Jaron Ennis collecting all the other belts gives him leverage too. It's not one way.
And he's still the biggest fight for you. That outside of him, there are not a lot of seven-figure paydays floating around.
Not for the Normans.
If and when they actually do fight, what I see is that maybe Brian Norman and Jaron Ennis are about even in terms of power, single punching power. They might be about even, but what will separate them is where Brian Norman is really limited to being a mid-range to inside fighter, Jaron Ennis is a bit more mobile, agile.
Tack on that he's a bit taller and he's a bit longer, so while he's on the fly, he's gonna walk Brian Norman into punches, not dissimilar to what he did to Roman Villa.
Now, because Brian Norman is a sizable puncher, and because Boots' defense isn't exactly the best,
yeah, he gets touched up here and there. He does get hit.
It still is an interesting contest, though at first glance, what I see is that Jaron Ennis is going to use Brian Norman's aggression against him. Brian Norman is a mid-range to inside guy who likes to get in close to get off his power shots, his hooks, his uppercuts, and all that stuff. But to get in close, he's got to come under heavy fire. Jaron Ennis has a little bit more height and a little bit more wingspan, and he fights on his toes.
Where Brian is a bit more flat-footed. Needs to plant his feet to get off those big power shots.
It's a good fight. It's a very good fight between unbeaten champions. I hope it happens. And my perspective on it is, there was a lot of hyperbole attached to Boots during his time at Showtime when they tried to bill him as the anti-Crawford.
They wanted to convince the boxing community at large that he was the answer to Terence Crawford. Time has told a story where he's just not as good as that guy.
Though still a good fighter in his own right, but these contests that he's having are more even than people originally thought, because he's not as good as Terence Crawford. It's not exactly a foregone conclusion that Boots wins all of these fights. Not all of them. There is still an air of intrigue, because Brian Norman is a sizable puncher, and Jaron Ennis has leaky defense. I like Ennis to win.
But I gotta see it. The fight has gotta happen.
For him to get the credit. Credit to Brian Norman for managing to stay WBO champion a while longer with a third-round knockout of Derek Cuevas.
Now let's see how long it takes to get him in the ring with the winner of Ennis versus Stanionis.
And now it's time for another episode of Ring IQ Hate Mail.
Because whenever I tell the truth and stick to the facts, these guys hate to hear it.
A disgruntled Errol Spence Jr. fan, who goes by the name Stephen Atwell, didn't like my suggestion in the previous video that Terrence Crawford is in fact the standout welterweight of his era.
He asked, how is Bud the face of the welterweight division with only 9 fights at 147?
Were you living under a rock or something? You didn't watch him go undisputed?
He claimed that resume-wise, Thurman, Spence, and Porter all have better overall resumes. If this is about needing multi-divisions, you may want to put Devon Alexander in the Hall of Fame. Based on 147-pound resumes, Bud's overall is the weakest between him, Spence, and Thurman, stronger than Berto and Danny Garcia.
So let's start here. Let's address the contention that both Errol Spence and Keith Thurman have better resumes than Terrence Crawford.
Start with Keith.
What's Keith Thurman's biggest win? Danny Garcia, Gatekeeper Danny, who lost to every top-shelf welterweight they put him in there with? If that's the crown jewel of Keith's resume, what's the crown jewel of Terrence's?
Errol Spence.
Keith really only has 2 solid wins as a welterweight, and that's the win over Sean Porter and the win over Danny. Whereas the win over Errol is better than both of those because Errol beat the both of them, and Terrence beat Errol. But he also knocked out Sean Porter.
It's a common opponent between Terrence and Keith.
Keith Thurman, who lost to a 40-year-old Manny Pacquiao who lost to Jeff Horn who lost to who?
Terrence Crawford.
You do realize that Terrence Crawford has taken more belts from more champions at 147 than Keith Thurman has. Keith was elevated to WBA champion. He never won it from Floyd Mayweather.
He was elevated after Floyd retired. The only guy that Keith ever won a belt from was Gatekeeper Danny.
Terrence beat 2 welterweight champions to Keith Thurman's 1. He beat Jeff Horn for the WBO.
Jeff won it from Manny, and Terrence won it from Jeff.
And Terrence beat unified welterweight champion Errol Spence Jr., who beat Sean Porter and beat Danny Garcia, Kell Brook.
So how does Keith have a better resume than Terrence when Keith's biggest win is Danny Garcia?
He doesn't have a better resume than Terrence. That's just PBC propaganda. Let's go over to Errol. Does Errol Spence Jr. have a better resume than Terrence?
At 147.
Well, they both have Sean Porter as a common opponent. The difference is, when Errol fought him, he went life or death with Sean, whereas when Terrence fought him, he stopped him.
It was a corner stoppage. Kenny Porter threw the towel. Sean was getting hit too much.
What's the best win on Errol Spence Jr.'s resume? Kell Brook coming off a loss to Gennady Golovkin?
What's Terrence's best win at welter?
Beating Errol, who beat Kell Brook. It also helps that Terrence beat Kell Brook as well.
I'm not seeing how Errol has a better resume than Terrence, especially since Terrence beat Errol.
What kind of mental gymnastics are these? They've got 1 or 2 common opponents between them, all of which Terrence Crawford beat in more dominant fashion, and it also helps that he actually beat Errol. It's not just a resume argument. He beat the crap out of this guy. It wasn't competitive.
So what is this Stephen Atwell person not understanding? Where does he get that Errol has a better resume than Terrence?
He's just trying to rationalize a way to deprive Terrence of credit for winning the fight. He said it's easy to beat a weight-drained fighter.
Oddly enough, I didn't see people saying Spence was drained when he stopped Yordenis Ugas. I saw people saying he was the eye collector, and he was going to collect Terrence Crawford's eye. That's what I saw.
But the Stephen Atwell guy said, it's easy to beat a weight-drained fighter. When Bud said Mean Machine hit harder than Spence, that told me all I needed to know.
Oh, so the reason you're not giving Terrence Crawford credit is because Spence was weight-drained. And whose fault is that?
Because I remember Terrence and Bob Arum, they wanted to do the fight in 2018 and 2019, and this is what Errol Spence Jr. had to say.
I know. Person. So have I. What do you say? Can we get both of them in the ring? Can we get both of them in the ring? He said, I'm fighting Mikey. Then I might fight Sean Porter, Keith Thurman.
So he didn't mention Terrence, huh?
He didn't.
When he get a belt, you want to go over there. Keith Thurman want to go over there. And now y'all want to say, oh, I ain't fought nobody. But I got a belt now, so why? Okay.
Sharon Porter got a belt too.
So now
Sharon Porter got a belt too.
Now, I think the whole bit about Errol being weight trained is just an excuse because he was doing just fine up until he fought Terrence. But let's just go with that for a second. That if in the process of this PBC round robin that you participated in, you outgrow 147, that's your fault.
It's your goddamn problem. Terrence and Bob wanted to do the fight in 2018 and 2019. You're the one that wanted to wait.
Errol Spence Jr. and the PBC were the ones stalling. The Stephan guy tries to justify it by saying that, well, Terrence shouldn't have signed to Top Rank.
You know who else signed to Top Rank? Tyson Fury.
And Fury signing to Top Rank didn't stop the second Wilder fight from happening, or the third. So why is being signed to Top Rank an issue when it comes to Terrence, but it wasn't an issue when it came to Fury?
According to Stephan, it's because Fury was worth 5 times more than Terrence.
So wait a minute. You're saying that they decided to work with Top Rank for the Fury fight because the Fury fight was worth more.
Aren't you admitting that the PBC were the ones stalling? That they decided to work with Top Rank for one fight but not the other because they didn't think the other was worth it?
Stephan said that's part of it. It's also fear of the notion Bud could have lost as well. Also, I told you years ago, non-heavyweights, black versus black doesn't sell.
What?
You're saying that the PBC didn't want to do this fight because a black welterweight versus a black welterweight doesn't sell, except this fight sold more than any of Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-views. It sold 2 times more than his fight with Mikey Garcia. So what the hell are you talking about?
To date, this was Errol Spence Jr.'s biggest box office appearance. It just doesn't help that he lost.
Let's condense it. Sides of the Street was not the issue because they had no problem working with Top Rank for a Tyson Fury fight, and he was on the same side of the street as Terrence. So Sides of the Street was not the issue, and pay-per-view sales were not the issue, because in terms of sales, Errol sold more pay-per-views with this fight than any fight before it. It's the biggest fight he ever had. Selling pay-per-views was not the issue. Losing was the issue, because they knew, underneath it all, he's gonna lose. And that's why they stalled for 5 years.
That's why they didn't do it in 2018 and 2019 when they could have.
That's why they kept Errol Spence Jr. away from Terrence Crawford and out of that fight for 5 years.
So that fanboys like you can come here and tell me that Errol has a better resume than Terrence? Are you stupid?
No, your butt hurt because you're a sore loser, like the rest of the Spence fans trying to rewrite history and tell the story a different way. The facts don't stack up the way you want them to.
They never will.
You're depriving Terrence Crawford of credit for winning a fight that you thought he was gonna lose, so that when he wins, oh, it's just because Errol was weight trained.
And whose fault is that?
I didn't think I'd still have to be making segments like this one in 2025, but the Errol Spence Jr. faction of fans are an ignorant bunch.
You have to keep these guys in line. You have to check them, because if you don't, they're gonna try to rewrite history.
Even if I went with your version of the story, it's still Errol Spence's fault for putting a Crawford fight on the back burner. You're the one that wanted to wait. When it blows up in your face, I ain't gonna feel sorry for you.
I told Stephan years ago on Facebook this was gonna happen.
It's that old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can give a guy all the facts, but you can't make him think.
Can't fix stupid.